The storm rolled across Lake Placid like it had a grudge against the earth itself. Trees bent, rain lashed sideways, and the water churned in angry waves that swallowed the moonlight whole. From my porch, through the blur of the storm, I saw a figure at the edge of the dock, small, hunched, but moving with a strange kind of purpose. It was my daughter-in-law, Cassie. She was dragging something heavy behind her. At first, I thought it was luggage, but no one travels at midnight in weather like that. The wind caught her hood, whipping her hair across her face, yet she kept pushing forward, step after determined step, until she reached the end of the dock. Lightning cracked across the lake. For a split second, I saw her clearly, rain-slick, trembling, eyes locked on the dark water. She bent down, gripped the handle of the suitcase, and with a sound halfway between a grunt and a sob, hurled it into the lake. The splash vanished into the roar of the storm. My hands froze on the railing, my heart thudded once, twice, and then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A soft, muffled thump from inside the suitcase before the lake swallowed it whole. For a few heartbeats, I couldn't move. The wind tore at my nightgown, the rain stung my face, but my mind was locked on that single sound, the faint, smothered knock from inside that sinking case. "Dear Lord, no," I whispered, gripping the railing so tight my fingers burned. The lake swallowed everything in seconds, the ripples vanishing into the black. My throat went dry. Was it an animal? Something alive? Or someone? I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but fear glued my feet to the porch. Through the sheets of rain, Cassie stood at the dock's edge, staring into the water. Not for long, just a moment, maybe two, before she turned sharply and disappeared into the house, her raincoat glinting like oil in the lightning's flash. The night closed in again. I felt old in that moment, every one of my 68 years pressed down like a weight on my shoulders. My mind was racing faster than my heartbeat. What had I just witnessed? A crime? A mistake? The rain eased, but I didn't. My breath came shallow, uneven. I stayed there until Cassie's lights flickered off, the house swallowed by darkness. Only then did I whisper, barely audible, "Wesley, what has she done to you now?" I didn't sleep a single minute that night. The rain slowed to a drizzle, but the sound of that muffled thump wouldn't leave my head. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw Cassie's face lit by lightning, calm, focused, almost relieved. By dawn, the storm had passed. The lake looked peaceful again, its surface smooth and still, as if it hadn't swallowed a secret only hours before. That quiet made it worse. It mocked me. I stood at the window, gripping a cup of coffee I couldn't drink. The house was too still. Every tick of the kitchen clock reminded me of the years my husband, Victor, spent fixing those very gears, and how the world had made sense when he was here. But now, my son's wife had just tossed something into the lake, and I didn't know whether to call the police or a priest. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the storm played tricks on my eyes, but deep down, I knew better. Cassie never did anything without a reason. If you think you've seen betrayal, think again. Before I tell you what I found inside that suitcase, make sure you're subscribed, because this story will change how you see trust forever. And believe me, you'll want to hear every word. Before everything changed, life was steady, not perfect, not glamorous, but beautifully steady. Our little farmhouse in Connecticut had a rhythm all its own. Mornings started with the smell of Victor's black coffee, the sound of his radio humming old blues, and the soft creak of the porch swing as he read the paper. My husband, Victor Thorne, believed in truth like it was oxygen. He used to say, "If something feels wrong, it usually is." That simple rule guided every part of our life. We built our home, our marriage, and our son around it. Wesley grew up in that house, a quiet, curious boy, with steady hands and a mind that never wandered. When other kids played ball, Wesley was in the garage, fixing things, clocks, radios, anything with gears. He loved the certainty of small moving parts, the way everything could be restored with care and patience. Our lives were simple. Family dinners on Sundays, laughter that came easy. Victor taught Wesley the value of hard work, and I taught him the value of kindness. It wasn't a grand life, but it was ours, clean, honest, and grounded in love. Even after Wesley became a civil engineer and bought his own home, he never missed a Sunday visit. He'd still tinker with Victor's old clock collection when he came by, saying, "It helps me think, Mom." That was before Cassie came along. Wesley met her at an art gala in Atlanta. He'd been sent there for a city infrastructure project, the kind that kept him buried in blueprints and long hours. Cassie Hayes was everything he wasn't: glamorous, loud, effortlessly social, the kind of woman who drew attention just by standing still. When he first told me about her, his voice held that rare spark I hadn't heard in years. He said, "She's full of life, Mom. You'd like her." I wanted to believe him. I really did. So when he brought her home for dinner that spring, I made her favorite dish, or at least what I was told was her favorite: lemon, rosemary chicken. She arrived 30 minutes late, smiling as if time bowed to her. Her perfume filled the house before her laughter did. Cassie was polite enough, but every compliment came wrapped in a quiet sting. When she said, "This old farmhouse is adorable, like something out of history," I could feel the word old sit heavy in my chest. She told stories of high-end clients, art exhibitions, and trips abroad, pausing every so often to flash her perfect teeth and look around our modest living room as if she were touring a museum of the past. Victor had passed by then, and I remember thinking how much he would have seen through that charm. Wesley, though, was completely taken. She called him Wes, a nickname no one in our family ever used. In her voice, even his name sounded different, like she was rewriting who he was, one syllable at a time. They were engaged within 4 months. I remember staring at the announcement photo. Wesley sent me the two of them standing by a fountain, his arms stiff around her waist, his smile careful. Hers, on the other hand, was perfect. Cassie knew how to look happy for the camera, even when her eyes stayed cold. The first few visits after their engagement felt like an audition I didn't know I was part of. Cassie would glide through my home, running her fingers along furniture Victor built by hand, nodding as if evaluating a showroom. "You've kept everything so traditional," she'd say, her tone too smooth to challenge directly but sharp enough to leave marks. I tried to overlook it. Wesley deserved peace, not tension between the two women in his life. But as months passed, it became clear Cassie wasn't content just marrying my son. She wanted to reshape him. He traded his flannel shirts for tailored suits, his weekends fixing clocks for art show openings. Even his voice changed, softer, uncertain, always seeking her approval. When they bought their new home, I offered to help decorate. Cassie smiled, thanked me, and later told Wesley she'd hired professionals. That was when I first felt the shift. The air between us grew thin, conversations shorter, her visits rarer. Every attempt I made to reach my son seemed to pass through her first filtered, delayed, controlled. She smiled with her mouth, not her eyes, and slowly, she erased my son from the man Victor and I raised. The first sign was small. Wesley stopped coming by on Sundays. At first there were reasons that sounded reasonable. "We've got a dinner with Cassie's investors," or "she's hosting a weekend event at the gallery." Little things that seemed harmless on their own. But those little things started to pile up. By spring, he'd missed 3 family dinners in a row. When he finally did visit, he arrived in a suit that didn't look like him, sleek, expensive, and too sharp for a man who used to spend his weekends fixing clocks. His hair was styled differently, and he wore cologne that smelled like the kind of store I'd never shop in. He smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It didn't reach his eyes. I asked if he'd been sleeping well. He brushed it off. "Cassie's been keeping me busy, Mom. Lots of networking, lots of social stuff." Networking. That wasn't a word my son used before. He stayed for less than an hour that day. When he left, I watched from the porch as Cassie honked the car horn twice, not impatiently, but as a reminder. A signal that she was waiting, and he belonged to her time now, not mine. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table and realized the distance between us wasn't measured in miles. It was being built inch by inch, conversation by conversation. Cassie had a gift for saying things that sounded thoughtful but always carried an edge. When I called to invite them for Thanksgiving, she laughed softly and said, "Oh, Sylvia, we already promised to attend a charity dinner that night. You understand, don't you?" I said I did, but something inside me broke a little. That was the first Thanksgiving table I set for one. Christmas came, and I tried again. Wesley texted that morning, Sorry, Mom. Cassie's family planned a ski trip last minute. I could almost hear her voice behind his words, smooth and practiced. She didn't just take up his time, she rewrote his priorities. When I finally saw him again, it was at a friend's retirement party. He looked thinner, paler, his laugh shorter than it used to be. Cassie never left his side. Each time I tried to speak with him alone, she'd lean in, touch his arm, and steer the conversation elsewhere. Even the lake cottage, our family's refuge, started slipping away. Cassie said the place was too damp, too small, too outdated. She called it quaint, the way people describe something they'll never visit again. I told Wesley that his father built that cottage with his own hands. He nodded, distracted, checking his phone. Cassie whispered something in his ear, and they both laughed. Every time she said "we," a piece of my son disappeared. My phone used to light up every few days with Wesley's name. We'd talk about everything: his projects, the clocks he was restoring, even silly things like which pie I was baking that week. Those calls grew shorter, then stopped altogether. When I finally reached him after weeks of silence, Cassie answered instead. "He's in a meeting, Sylvia. I'll have him call you back." He didn't. Weeks turned into months. When I texted, she replied. When I asked to visit, she said the house was under renovation. Every interaction became a polite barrier. I started saving her messages, reading them over at night, trying to find meaning between the lines. The tone was always pleasant, but I could feel the distance widening with every "maybe next week," and "we'll see." One afternoon, Wesley did call. His voice sounded tired, worn. He said, "Cassie thinks we need a break from constant family obligations. It's just been too much lately." Obligations. That word struck like a knife. Family wasn't an obligation. It was the air we breathed. That night, I stood by Victor's old desk, running my hands over his unfinished clock. Its gears had stopped years ago, but I couldn't bring myself to fix it. Somehow, it felt fitting. Because what do you do when time stops not on the wall, but inside the people you love? Have you ever watched someone you love become a stranger right before your eyes? When Victor passed, the silence in the house felt heavier than grief. He'd been my anchor, the kind of man who left order behind, even in death. Every drawer labeled, every document signed. He made sure Wesley would never struggle the way we once did. Victor created a trust fund for our son, sealed tight with clear instructions. The money was never to be touched except for retirement or emergency. "Security is a gift you give your child, not a burden you hand them," he'd said. After the funeral, Wesley came home often, sitting in Victor's old chair, staring at the tools his father used to repair clocks. Those visits slowed once Cassie entered the picture. When I asked about the trust one afternoon, Wesley's tone shifted. "Cassie thinks we're being too cautious," he said, tapping the table as if repeating something she'd drilled into him. "We found a historic estate in Westchester, a solid investment. She says we shouldn't let the opportunity slip by." I nearly dropped my teacup. "Your father's trust isn't for show homes, Wesley. He built that for your safety." He sighed. "Mom, Cassie's done the research. It's not a risk." I wanted to believe him, but the word risk never sat right in Victor's house. That night, I looked through Victor's papers, tracing his handwriting neat, deliberate, and full of purpose. I whispered to the empty chair, "You built a wall to protect him, Victor, and she's finding the cracks." The sale happened faster than I could blink. One month, Wesley mentioned they were considering options. The next, they were closing on a mansion with stone pillars, guest suites, and a driveway long enough to lose your breath walking it. Cassie called it an architectural masterpiece. I called it reckless. When I visited for the first time, she welcomed me with a tour, every room echoing with emptiness. The house looked like it belonged to people who wanted to be seen, not to live. She pointed out imported marble, custom lighting, and art pieces on loan from her gallery connections. I listened quietly, trying not to let my jaw tighten. Wesley trailed behind her, looking proud but weary. When I asked if they could truly afford it, he smiled in that careful way of his. "Cassie ran the numbers, Mom. She's good with these things." Good with these things. That line haunted me for weeks. Later, when I reviewed the property transfer notice that arrived in the mail, a courtesy copy Victor had arranged for me before he died, my stomach dropped. The down payment wasn't just large, it was taken against the trust's principal. Cassie had done what Victor explicitly warned against. She'd convinced Wesley to borrow against his future to build her present. I stared at the paper until the ink blurred. All I could hear was Victor's voice. If something feels wrong, it usually is. It felt wrong. Deeply wrong. I needed answers. So, I called Dorian Hayes, Victor's longtime colleague, and the man who helped set up the trust years ago. Dorian had known our family for decades, quiet, dependable, and loyal to a fault. When I told him what had happened, there was a pause long enough to make my heart pound. He finally said, "Sylvia, that account wasn't meant to be touched. If he borrowed against it, that means someone pushed hard." I asked if Wesley had spoken to him recently. Another pause. "Only briefly," Dorian replied. He sounded nervous, said he was exploring a private tech investment, but when I asked who advised him, he changed the subject. The more I listened, the clearer the pattern became. Wesley wasn't acting out of ambition, he was acting under pressure. I could almost hear Cassie's voice behind his words. Every smart move sounded like something she'd rehearsed. Every new opportunity echoed her vocabulary, not his. Dorian lowered his tone. "Mrs. Thorne, he's digging himself into something he doesn't understand. If that trust is leveraged, it's not just a bad decision, it's dangerous." After we hung up, I sat by the window, watching the light fade over Victor's old workshop. The smell of sawdust still lingered in the air, though no wood had been cut in years. That night, I realized Cassie wasn't just changing Wesley's lifestyle, she was dismantling his foundation, one choice at a time. Cassie convinced him to borrow against his future. If someone ever tried to rewrite your family's legacy, would you stay silent? Subscribe now before someone else writes your ending. By habit, I visited Wesley once every quarter to help him review his financial papers, something Victor started years ago to keep our family's affairs in order. It wasn't about control, it was tradition. We'd sit at the oak desk in his library, check the trust statements, and drink coffee that always went cold halfway through the discussion. When I arrived that morning, Cassie greeted me at the door with her usual polite chill. Her perfume hit before her smile did. "Wesley's just finishing a call," she said, waving me toward the living room. "Make yourself comfortable." While I waited, I wandered toward the library, the heart of Wesley's home, the place that once smelled of old books and cedar. Victor had designed it himself, and the Persian rug that covered the floor safe had been there for decades. But when I stepped inside, my breath caught. The rug was gone, the old desk replaced by sleek white furniture, and on the floor a single yoga mat, rolled tight in the corner. I called out, "Wesley, where's the rug?" He walked in, rubbing the back of his neck. "Cassie thought the old setup felt dated," he said lightly. "We had some renovations done." Renovations. That word carried the same emptiness as every other change Cassie brought into his life. I crouched near the spot where the rug once lay, pressing my palm against the hardwood. The faint outline of a square remained Victor's hidden compartment, once sealed and guarded like a family heartbeat. "Where's the safe?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. Cassie entered then, barefoot and poised, a cup of green tea balanced in her hand. "Oh, that old thing?" she said casually. "It wasn't up to code. I had it removed when we redid the floors. Don't worry, everything's perfectly organized now." Her tone was silk over steel. I turned to Wesley. "You let them remove it?" He hesitated. "Mom, Cassie's right. The metal was rusting. We moved everything into a safety deposit box downtown." I wanted to believe him. But that safe wasn't just metal and bolts, it was Victor's way of protecting our son long after he was gone. Every important paper, every reminder of his planning, rested there. Cassie sipped her tea, unbothered. It was an eyesore. You can't build a modern space around old secrets. Old secrets. The words hit harder than she knew. I nodded politely, hiding the shake in my hands. "I see," I murmured. But inside, dread crept through me like ice water. The rug might have been gone, but so was something far greater, the last visible proof of Victor's hand in our lives. That evening, I sat in my own kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of one of Victor's repaired clocks. It struck me that every sound in that house carried his memory, but in Wesley's new home, not a trace of him remained. I pulled out the family photo albums from the cabinet. In one picture, Wesley was 12, holding a hammer beside his father as they installed that very safe. The pride on his face then was the kind of pride that comes from belonging. I touched the photograph gently. "She's erasing us," I whispered, "one piece at a time." Cassie hadn't just remodeled a room. She'd stripped away the last physical link between my husband's plans and my son's security. That safe had been built as a promise: protection, privacy, and legacy. Now it was gone, and all I had was Wesley's word that everything was secure. But words don't keep promises, actions do. I stared at the phone, debating whether to call him again, to beg him to check the documents himself. But I already knew the answer. Cassie would answer first. She always did. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, steady and soft, like Victor's hand reminding me to stay calm. But calm didn't feel safe anymore. That night, I made a decision. If Cassie was rewriting our story, I was going to find out how. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the empty space where the safe once Saturday. Victor's voice echoed in my head, steady, practical, unwilling to accept excuses. By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. If Cassie had moved the family's lifeline into a safety deposit box, there had to be digital proof. Victor had always backed up every document, every account. He never trusted memory alone. I opened the old wooden cabinet in his study and pulled out the worn laptop he'd used for bookkeeping. The hinges creaked like an old door, protesting the truth it was about to reveal. The screen flickered to life, still showing the same background photo of Wesley as a boy on the dock, holding a fishing rod too big for his hands. The email archives were still accessible through Victor's encrypted master account. I wasn't a tech expert, but years of marriage to Victor had taught me patience. I started scrolling through messages from banks, legal firms, and insurance agencies, searching for anything recent with Wesley's name attached. Hours passed. My coffee went cold again. Just when my eyes began to blur, I noticed a thread of messages between Cassie and a law firm in Manhattan. The firm's name was unfamiliar, but the subject line froze my hand mid-scroll. Policy, confirmation, Thorne, W.A. I clicked it open, my pulse hammering in my ears. The message referenced a newly purchased life insurance policy. The amount made my stomach twist: $5 million. The sole beneficiary, Cassandra Hayes. I stared at the screen so long the light began to sting my eyes. The words blurred, but the meaning was sharp enough to cut through bone. Cassie hadn't just taken control of Wesley's finances. She'd placed a dollar value on his life. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened until I had to press my hand against it, willing my heart to slow down. It didn't. I reached for the phone. There was only one person I trusted with this kind of discovery, Dorian. He'd handled Victor's affairs for years and treated every detail with quiet respect. When he answered, his voice was warm, steady, familiar. "Mrs. Thorne, it's been too long. How's Wesley doing?" I swallowed hard. "That's what I'm trying to find out." I forwarded the email while we spoke, my fingers trembling as I typed. He opened it on his end, and I could hear the shift in his tone before he even spoke. $5 million? He said softly. "Sylvia, this isn't normal. Not for someone like Wesley. That's a massive policy, especially one taken out so recently." He paused, and I heard him clicking through the document. "And the premium, it's paid in full. That means she already transferred the money up front. Do you understand what that implies?" "I understand too well," I whispered. Dorian exhaled sharply. "She's monetizing his death. It's structured for a payout within months of a verified claim. If anything happens to Wesley, she gets everything." The room spun for a second. I grabbed the edge of the desk, steadying myself. "Dorian," I said, my voice breaking, "you have to help me stop this." He hesitated, then replied quietly, "Mrs. Thorne, you'll need evidence, hard proof. Without it, you'll sound like a mother who can't let go." He was right. I had to find proof before Cassie found her moment. After I ended the call, I sat in silence for a long while. Outside, the sun had begun to set, painting the walls gold, but I barely noticed. Every detail Dorian mentioned, replayed in my mind like a cruel echo. Cassie had built a trap, not a physical one, but one made of paper, signatures, and false security. If Wesley's debts grew too large, if an accident happened, she would walk away a millionaire. I opened the email again, studying each line until I could practically recite it. Attached were documents I couldn't open without a password. But the summary alone was enough to reveal intent: policy registration, premium confirmation, immediate activation. I closed the laptop, feeling both sick and clear-headed. For months, I had been helpless watching Cassie erase pieces of our family, one tradition at a time. Now, for the first time, I had something solid. Fear still lived in my chest, but another feeling was beginning to rise, slow and steady: purpose. I walked to Victor's workshop and stood among his tools. His hammer, his measuring tape, his unfinished projects, they all seemed to wait for me, patient and silent. I wasn't losing my son to a grave built on paperwork, I said quietly. Not while I'm still breathing. I pulled out my notebook and began writing down every detail: dates, accounts, phone numbers, people Cassie mentioned in passing. If she thought I was a harmless old woman who couldn't keep up, she was about to learn otherwise. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't even feel tired. I felt awake, more awake than I'd been in years. Because I finally understood what Victor meant when he said, "If something feels wrong, it usually is." And this? This was wrong enough to fight for. I woke the next morning without an alarm, as if my body already knew there was no time to waste. The storm in my head had settled into something sharper: a decision. For months, I'd prayed that Wesley would see Cassie for who she truly was. Now I understood. He couldn't. She had tightened her hold too carefully. Every financial choice, every friendship, every phone call, she filtered it all, until my son lived inside her version of the world. But if Cassie built a cage out of lies, I could still find the key. I printed the email from the law firm and tucked it into a folder with Victor's old documents. Looking at his handwriting beside Cassie's digital trail filled me with a strange calm. His order met her chaos on that page. I packed a small bag, notebook, charger, the list of contacts Dorian had given me, and a photo of Wesley as a boy. That photo reminded me what I was fighting for. When I locked my front door, the air smelled of rain again, but this time it didn't frighten me. It felt like a push forward. Cassie might have thought she married a man with no defenses. She forgot he was raised by me. I drove to the small cafe where Victor and I used to meet Dorian for lunch. It felt strange sitting there alone. The same corner table, the same checkered tablecloth, but a different purpose entirely. Dorian arrived looking troubled. The lines on his face had deepened since our last talk. He ordered coffee but didn't touch it. "I ran a few checks after your call," he said quietly. "You were right. Cassie's been moving money through limited partnerships tied to art holdings. None of it connects directly to Wesley on paper." My stomach turned. "She's cleaning the trail." He nodded. "If anything happens to him, the payout would look legitimate. I've seen it before, just not this close to home." I stared out the window, watching people rush through the drizzle, each one carrying their own small storm. "Dorian," I said, "I'm not going to wait for her to finish what she started." He studied me for a moment, then gave a faint, knowing smile. "That sounds like Victor talking." I folded the printed email and slid it back into my bag. "It sounds like me." He reached across the table, his voice low. "Be careful, Sylvia. Cassie's clever. She hides behind respectability, but people like her always overreach. I'm counting on that." Walking out of the cafe, I felt something new stirring, not just fear, but focus. Cassie had played her game in silence for too long. Now it was my turn to set the rules. That night, I laid out everything on my kitchen table: the documents, Dorian's notes, the printout of the insurance email, even old photographs of Wesley and Victor at the lake cottage. It looked like a lifetime spread before me, one side filled with memories, the other with threats. I traced my fingers along the edges of the papers, feeling a strange sense of balance. Cassie had her weapons: charm, deceit, and influence. I had truth, patience, and time. And I knew how to use them. If she thought she'd buried every trail, she hadn't accounted for me. I was going to follow each thread until I found where her lies began. The lake cottage came to mind first. It was the one place Cassie never liked. She called it rustic. Victor called it ours. It was also where most of our original property documents had been kept before Wesley's marriage. I wondered now if Cassie had been trying to erase more than just that safe. I decided to go there before the season ended. I'd pretend to prepare it for winter, just another habit of an aging widow. But in truth, I'd be watching, waiting, and documenting everything Cassie did. As I packed my overnight bag, I glanced at the last family photo we ever took together. Victor smiling, Wesley laughing, Cassie perfect as always. I flipped it face down. "Not this time," I said quietly. "You won't win this time." For the first time since Victor's passing, my fear didn't feel like weakness. It felt like warning. The call came late on a Thursday. Wesley's voice carried that polite stiffness I'd grown to hate. "Mom, Cassie and I are driving up to the cottage this weekend. She wants to study some natural decay patterns for her next art exhibit." Natural decay. The irony wasn't lost on me. I told him I'd planned to winterize the cottage anyway, so I'd head up a day earlier. He hesitated, but Cassie's voice chimed faintly in the background, cheerful, insisting. "Of course, Sylvia should come. It'll be nostalgic." The moment I hung up, I started packing. The road to Lake Placid stretched long and quiet. Trees on either side leaned heavy with the last of autumn's gold. Every mile felt like traveling backward through my own life, the same route Victor and I had driven for decades, now colder, lonelier. When I reached the cottage, it greeted me like an old friend. Paint chipped, porch creaking, curtains still faintly smelling of cedar. I stepped inside, let the silence settle, and whispered to the empty room, "We're not done yet, old house." I spent the evening pretending to prepare for winter, draining pipes, dusting shelves, folding blankets, but my real work began at dawn. I crossed to the opposite side of the lake and set up a small observation spot in a thicket of trees. Victor's old binoculars were still clear, though a bit stiff at the hinges. From there, I waited. The cottage across the water looked peaceful, unaware that its peace was borrowed. Wesley and Cassie arrived just after noon the next day. His car door opened first, hers followed, slower, deliberate. She stepped out in boots too fine for the mud, surveyed the place like a curator inspecting a relic. Through the binoculars, I watched her give orders with that gentle smile that wasn't gentle at all. Wesley carried boxes, while she pointed first to the shed, then toward the dock. By sunset, they'd argued twice. Even at a distance I could read the gestures, his hands defensive, hers sharp and dismissive. Once, she turned away mid-sentence, phone pressed to her ear, pacing the porch while he stood in the doorway, small as a boy again. At night, their lights flickered from room to room. I kept watch until nearly midnight. Twice, I saw Wesley walk outside alone, standing by the water as if it could answer for his mistakes. The third time, Cassie followed him out, still holding her phone. They spoke briefly. He gestured toward the lake, and she shook her head and went back inside. The next morning, a heavy quiet settled. No arguments, no movement, just that still surface of water, reflecting their fragile calm. By the second evening, the tension had thickened enough to feel from across the water. I could sense the storm in them, not the kind that breaks branches, but the kind that erases what came before. Cassie spent hours on calls, pacing near the window. Wesley sat at the dock, skipping stones. Once, I saw him drop his head into his hands. My throat tightened. That was my boy, the one Victor and I had raised to build, not destroy. Just after dusk, Cassie emerged, wearing a rain jacket and boots. She carried something small, too small to identify, and walked toward the boathouse. Wesley didn't follow. I noted the time in my notebook, 8:47 p.m. When she came back, she stood on the porch looking over the lake, motionless for nearly a minute before going inside. I stayed awake long after their lights went dark, heart pounding, knowing what I'd seen was only the surface of a deeper fracture. The calm felt wrong, like the air before lightning strikes. I whispered to Victor's binoculars resting in my lap, "Keep me steady, just a little longer." The lake lay still, holding its secrets close. I waited, knowing the next time I looked through that lens, something irreversible would begin. Sleep never came that night. The sky above Lake Placid grumbled for hours before the first flash split it open. Rain came in sheets, striking the windows like thrown pebbles. I sat by the window with Victor's binoculars on the sill, the same way he used to wait for the first snowfall of winter. The power had gone out across the lake. Only Cassie and Wesley's cottage glowed faintly, the candlelight moving behind thin curtains. When the thunder hit, it sounded close enough to shake my ribs. I almost put the binoculars away, telling myself no sane person would be out in that weather. But something pulled me back to the lens, an instinct older than fear. Through the streaks of rain, I saw the front door open. A figure stepped out, covered head to toe in a slick raincoat. Even from a distance, the stance was unmistakable Cassie. She held an umbrella in one hand and something large in the other, dragging it down the wooden steps. The wind caught her hood, whipping it sideways. She paused, adjusted her grip, then kept moving toward the dock. Lightning lit the sky again, bright enough to turn the lake white for a heartbeat. That was when I saw it. A dark, rectangular case bouncing against her legs. A suitcase. She struggled with it, slipping once, steadying herself, then pressing forward through the rain. I lowered the binoculars, my breath trapped halfway between disbelief and dread. The storm reached its peak as Cassie reached the dock. The lake churned, waves striking the posts hard enough to send spray over her boots. I watched, frozen, as she crouched, adjusted the suitcase handle, and with one forceful motion, swung it into the water. The sound of the splash vanished under the roar of thunder, but the image burned itself into me, the case hitting, sinking fast, a flash of silver zipper catching the lightning before disappearing below the surface. She didn't move right away. She stood there, shoulders heaving, staring down into the water as if expecting it to answer her. Then she straightened, smoothed her hair, and turned back toward the house. That was when I heard it. At first, I thought the wind had changed a whimper, faint, wrong. I pressed the binoculars to my eyes again, searching the dock, the shoreline, the rippling water. It came again, softer but unmistakable, a muffled cry from beneath the storm. My hands shook so badly the binoculars nearly slipped. I tore open the window, shouting her name, but the wind stole my voice before it reached the trees. Cassie never looked back. She walked up the steps, calm and unhurried, the front door closing behind her like the final note of a song. The lake swallowed the suitcase completely. Only the rain remained, drumming a steady rhythm that felt cruelly normal. I stumbled outside without thinking, my boots sinking into the mud. The air was cold enough to sting, but I didn't feel it. I ran to the edge of the water, straining to see through the downpour. Nothing. Only ripples spreading wider, fading fast. "Wesley!" I shouted, though I knew he couldn't hear me. The wind answered instead, carrying back a hollow echo. For a moment, I thought about running across to their side of the lake, but reason stopped me. I didn't know what waited inside that house, and the storm had turned the shoreline into sludge. So I stood there, soaked, shaking, heart pounding, watching the spot where the suitcase had vanished. The sky flashed again, and the reflection of my own face stared back from the black water, pale, terrified, unrecognizable. When the rain finally eased, I turned and made my way back to the cottage. My clothes clung heavy against my skin. Victor's binoculars dangled from my hand, slick with rain, the lenses clouded. I set them on the table and whispered to the dark room. She threw it in the lake, but something inside was still alive. "If this were your family, would you call the police or dig for the truth?" The storm ended just before sunrise, leaving the lake wrapped in fog. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. I hadn't slept. Every flash from the night before replayed in my head, Cassie's shape at the dock, the arc of that suitcase disappearing underwater, the muffled sound that still wouldn't leave my ears. At first light, I called Dorian. My voice shook so badly he barely recognized it. "Dorian, I need you at the cottage. Bring your gear." He didn't ask questions. "I'm on my way." By the time his truck crunched down the gravel road, I was waiting at the dock wrapped in Victor's old coat. Dorian stepped out carrying an oxygen tank, rope, and a flashlight sealed in plastic. He looked at me once, long enough to read the truth in my face. "What did she do?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," I said, "but I heard something in that lake." He nodded. No more words. Together we prepared the small boat. The motor coughed, then settled into a steady hum as he steered toward the middle of the lake. Mist hung low, turning every sound into a whisper. When we reached the spot, he slipped on his mask, adjusted the light, and dropped backward into the water with a single splash. I gripped the side of the boat, eyes fixed on the shifting surface, waiting for a sign. Minutes stretched into forever. I paced the boat's edge, whispering prayers under my breath. Then, through the fog, I saw bubbles rising. Dorian broke the surface, gasping. His voice was hoarse when he called out, "Found it." He hooked the rope around the handle and pulled with slow, heavy strokes until the suitcase bumped against the hull. Even waterlogged, it carried weight that felt wrong. We guided it back to the dock together, dragging it onto the planks where Victor used to tie his fishing boat. The suitcase was bloated, its leather darkened and warped. The zipper teeth were twisted, fused by pressure. The smell of mud and rust filled the air. Dorian caught his breath and reached for a crowbar. The first strike rang through the quiet morning, a hollow metallic cry that made me flinch. The second blow cracked the latch clean off. He stopped then, looking at me. "Are you sure you want to see this?" I nodded. My hands shook as I pressed them together. "If I don't, no one will believe me." He wedged the crowbar under the seam. The suitcase creaked open, water spilling out in a slow, grim stream across the dockboards. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Please God, not my boy." For a heartbeat, all I saw was darkness inside the case. Then Dorian reached in and lifted out a sealed plastic folder. Another followed, and another thick packets labeled with legal headers, company names, and signatures. He opened one, scanned the top page, and looked up at me. "These are property deeds, transfer records, forged ones. She wasn't hiding a body, Sylvia. She was hiding her tracks." I sank onto the dock, shaking. She used the lake as her filing cabinet. He pulled out the last packet, heavier than the rest. It bore the logo of the same Manhattan firm from the insurance email. Inside lay a single policy document, the $5 million policy in Wesley's name. The ink bled at the edges, but Cassie's signature was clear as daylight. My stomach turned. All those nights worrying about my son's safety, and the truth was right here, sealed and sinking just yards from our family's home. Dorian placed a hand on my shoulder. "You were right. She's been moving everything through shell companies. These papers could ruin her." I stared at the case lying open beside us, water dripping steadily from its corners back into the lake. My body trembled, but my voice came out steady. "She tried to bury proof, not people. But she's going to learn that lies don't stay buried forever." The morning sun broke through the fog, touching the surface of the water with pale gold. For the first time in months, I felt the faintest pull of relief, thin, fragile, but real. The air on the dock felt heavy, as if the lake itself knew what had just surfaced. Dorian laid the folders out on an old towel, separating each one with careful hands. The papers glistened under the thin morning light, edges curling as the moisture tried to escape. He opened one stack at a time, his brow tightening. "These signatures are forged. Look at the loops. Cassie's handwriting, not Wesley's." I leaned closer. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. She'd mimicked his pen stroke well enough for anyone who didn't love him. The next folder contained property deeds for houses we never owned, fake holdings designed to funnel money through accounts I'd never heard of. Another was full of false contracts linking Wesley's company to shell corporations registered in Cassie's name. Dorian exhaled. She's been siphoning from his trust for months, moving funds through art sales, then back into her personal accounts. I pressed my palm to my mouth, and he had no idea. He shook his head, probably thought he was signing routine paperwork. The last envelope bore Victor's signature. I froze. That's his will. We unsealed it. Inside were two versions, Victor's genuine document, and one that Cassie had rewritten to redirect the estate through Wesley's assets and by extension, herself. The difference was a single paragraph, yet it changed everything. I felt my knees weaken, the papers blurred through my tears. "My son isn't dead," I whispered, "but she killed his life." For a long while neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the lapping of the lake and the faint rustle of damp pages. I clutched Victor's will against my chest, the ink staining my fingers. Every moment of the past 2 years lined up in my mind like dominoes, The missing safe, the trust withdrawal, the new mansion, the isolation. She'd planned it all step by step, while smiling across my dinner table. Dorian broke the silence first. Sylvia, these documents could put her in prison. Fraud, misappropriation, identity theft, it's all here. I shook my head slowly. It's not just about punishment. She wanted to erase every trace of what Victor built. She didn't steal money. She stole meaning. He studied me. So what now? I looked out over the water, still holding the ruined papers. The lake had gone perfectly still, the fog lifting to reveal clear reflections of pine and sky. For the first time, I understood why Cassie had chosen this place. Water doesn't burn evidence, it hides it. She thought the lake would keep her secrets. She chose the wrong witness, I said quietly. The wrong mother. Dorian nodded. Then we start documenting. Photographs, timestamps, every item cataloged. When we take this to the authorities, it needs to be airtight. I bent over the papers, taking pictures with my phone, each click a small act of defiance. By late afternoon, the sun had dried the dock. The documents lay in neat rows, their ugliness exposed in daylight. Dorian packed them into waterproof sleeves. I sat nearby, exhausted but strangely calm. You know, I said, Victor used to tell Wesley that truth has a strange way of surfacing. No matter how deep you sink it, it finds air. Dorian zipped the final sleeve shut. He was right. I stared at the open suitcase. The smell of lake water and rust clung to it. She used that same space to hide the proof that will destroy her. It's almost poetic. Dorian placed a hand on my shoulder. Do you want me to call Wesley? Not yet, I said. He needs to see her mask fall first. If I warn him now, she'll twist the story. He nodded, understanding. When he drove away with the evidence secured, I stayed behind on the dock. The lake rippled softly, as if nothing had happened. I let the last of my tears fall into the water. Victor, I murmured. We caught her. She tried to sink you, but you're still here in every page she forged, in every truth that refused to drown. The sky turned amber. The light stretched across the lake, reaching toward the cottage that once belonged to us. I stood, wiped my eyes, and whispered to the quiet air, this isn't over. The following morning, I met Dorian at the courthouse. My hands still smelled faintly of lake water even after a dozen washes. Inside, my bag sat the waterproof folders, the proof Cassie believed she'd erased. We presented everything to the district attorney, who listened without interruption. When Dorian spread the documents across the table, the room fell silent. The forged deeds, the policy, the duplicate, were all arranged like pieces of a puzzle finally assembled. The DA leaned forward. This is enough to open a full investigation. The assets connected to these shell companies will be frozen immediately. I nodded once. It wasn't joy I felt, just relief, the kind that comes after months of holding your breath. From there, things moved quickly. Cassie's name appeared on legal bulletins across 2 states. Court orders were issued, her accounts flagged. The gallery she ran in Manhattan went dark within days. Every lie she'd built her empire on started to collapse under its own weight. That evening, Dorian called with an update. They've seized the Westchester property, he said. Investigators found duplicate signatures on the mortgage papers. It's unraveling fast. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. 2 days later, I drove to Wesley's house. The mansion that once looked untouchable now stood silent, a for investigation notice taped across the gate. He opened the door with eyes hollow from disbelief. Mom, he said, voice trembling. What did you do? I showed the truth, I replied simply. We sat in the stripped living room. The walls were bare where Cassie's paintings once hung. I handed him a folder. He scanned the pages, the insurance policy, the false contracts, the altered will. Each page drained a little more color from his face. When he reached the last document, his shoulders caved. She told me these were legal updates. She said you didn't trust me. I touched his hand gently. She counted on you, believing her. But trust isn't blind, Wesley. It's built on truth. He pressed his palms to his eyes, shaking. I thought I was building a future. I was just financing her escape. You still have a future, I said. She just doesn't own it anymore. Outside, I could hear reporters gathering near the gate, cameras clicking. I closed the curtains and whispered, let them take pictures of the wreckage. It's hers, not not yours. Weeks passed. The legal process moved slower than I wanted, but its direction never faltered. Cassie's accounts were frozen, her reputation in ruins. The gallery shut down. Her business partners withdrew overnight. When I finally saw her again, it was in a hearing room. She avoided my eyes, dressed in muted gray instead of the colors she used to flaunt. Wesley sat beside me, silent but steady. The judge read through the findings, one by one. Fraud, forgery, misappropriation. Her voice didn't shake, but the life Cassie had crafted crumbled word by word. As we walked out afterward, Wesley whispered, "You didn't have to go this far." I looked at him and answered softly, "Sometimes, the best revenge is simply revealing the truth they tried to drown." Outside the courthouse, the wind carried the smell of rain again. I tilted my face toward it and thought of Victor of the safe, the lake, the quiet strength he'd taught me. The world hadn't turned kinder, but it had turned honest again. That night, back at the cottage, I sat on the porch and watched the water. The surface was calm now, unbroken, as if waiting for peace to return. I closed my eyes and said, "We're free, Victor. She can't touch him anymore." And for the first time in a long time, the silence felt like peace. I've told this story 100 times in my mind, trying to decide where it truly began, at the lake, at the wedding, or the moment I ignored the small voice that said, "Something isn't right." Maybe it started long before Cassie ever walked into our lives. Maybe it began with love itself, the kind that trusts too easily and doubts too late. When I look back now, I see how fragile trust can be when it's handed to the wrong hands. Money built on lies will always sink. It might float for a while, shining and pretending to belong, but sooner or later it finds the bottom where truth waits. Wesley is rebuilding. The mansion is gone, the gallery is gone, but he's learning that loss can clear the ground for something better. Some nights we sit by the fireplace in the cottage, quiet, no need for words. He still carries guilt, but I remind him, "You can't blame yourself for someone else's shadow." I've kept the lake calm since then. Every sunrise feels like a promise that nothing hidden stays that way forever. If you've stayed with me through this story, take this part to heart. Evil rarely announces itself. It smiles, it flatters, it pretends to help. Cassie didn't break us with violence. She did it with charm, with small words that sounded kind and clever until they hollowed everything out. So, listen closely to how people speak about love, about family, about money. Real love protects, it never isolates. Real partnership builds, it doesn't erase. I don't tell my story for pity. I tell it because there are Cassies everywhere, men and women, who measure affection by what they can take. You may think it could never happen in your family. That's what I thought too. Now I know better. And knowing is what saves you. If this story moved you, share it. Someone you know might need this warning before it's too late. Because sometimes the smallest truth shared in time can stop a much bigger tragedy. The lake is quiet tonight. The moon lays a silver path across the water, the same path Victor used to row under when he came home from fishing. I still keep one of his lanterns on the porch. When the light flickers, I imagine it's him reminding me that peace doesn't come from forgetting, it comes from facing what's real. I touch the railing, the wood smooth under my fingers, and whisper, "Thank you for staying with me." To everyone listening, remember this: love your family enough to see what others won't. Don't look away from discomfort. It's often the first clue that something's wrong. Ask questions, stay present, and trust the voice inside you that whispers wait when everyone else says hurry. Life will always test what we value most. Greed, pride, deception, they come dressed as opportunity. But truth, though quiet, outlasts them all. Cassie taught me that even the cleverest lies can drown when the right eyes are watching. So I keep watching for Wesley, for Victor's memory, and for every family who still believes good intentions can't hide cruelty. Because the moment you choose to see, you've already begun to win.